Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Salam Media. It is the 30th of May, the day after what some are saying is a historic election that took place yesterday. It has just gone at 9:47. This morning we are discussing different aspects of the election. We just covered, talking about the voter psyche and some of the challenges that possibly was faced yesterday. But now I think we're getting into the meat of the results. Obviously, it's early days. Some voting stations literally up until this morning was still counting, and that was because there was just some unprecedented numbers in some areas. Joining us this morning, we have Zaakirah Vadi, who is online with us, and she's going to help us unpack some of these early results. A lot of people are not making sense of it because it looks interesting. Assalamu alaikum, Zaakirah, and welcome to Salam Media.
Walaikum salam, Zaakirah for hosting me on air.
Cool. Zaakirah, there are some obviously interesting insights, in terms of the early results that have come in. What are some of the key things, I think, if somebody was just to get a quick snapshot of what is happening at the moment, what would you say what the early results represent or show?
So it's I think just a bit too early to begin speculating on results as they come in. We would only like to delve into that once the final results come through. What is an important indicator from what took place yesterday, though, is that it does seem that we had a very high voter turnout. So the IEC has indicated already that the voter turnout, according to their estimation, is higher than the 2019 elections. And I think that's an important indicator, of people's interest in democracy. Some will interpret it perhaps as people wanting to play a more active role, wanting to ensure that things work in this country. But ultimately, I think we have for those results to come through as well before making a final determination on the factors behind it.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the key things, if somebody was to log on to the IEC dashboard at this particular time, I think there might be two things that will surprise a lot of people. I think one, it's the Patriotic Alliance that is kind of up there in the top 5 or 6 political parties, kind of outperforming already so early. Some of the more well-funded parties, even if they're new, and some of the more, the older parties, whether we look at, the IFP or, the ACDP, etc. And we know it's early days, but just the fact that they did contest in 2019 and the fact that they had no representation whatsoever in 2019, and that somebody somehow gone back to the drawing board. And now it looks like, if you just look at the early results, they look like they possibly have one seat confirmed already. So that is obviously something that is that a lot of people for a number of people. So I do agree with you. It is quite early, to make projections. But what do you think of that particular surge? What appears to be support for the Patriotic Alliance?
So I think it's going to be interesting to see what takes place, particularly with new political parties in this election. We must remember that the regional ballot is something that was new. And in my sort of estimation, I think that the regional ballot wasn't really very well understood. A few days ago, I was speaking to someone who thought that the regional ballot meant your local vote, as if you're voting for a local councillor. And based on that, I think, during local government elections, for example, people are far more open to the idea of independent candidates or smaller political parties. And if that was the kind of understanding that people had about the regional ballot, which certainly isn't the case in reality, the regional ballot is something quite different, then we're going to see, I think, a real mixed bag of results coming in relation to that. In relation to the PA in particular, I think it's going to be important to see what's the overall outcomes. But they have had appeal. In particular provinces, they have a certain support base that I think would have come out to support them. But the same can be said for other political parties like MK, for instance, a very new political party. And as I was watching yesterday, the results coming in do seem to have had quite a bit of support at that particular voting station where the results were coming from. So with smaller political parties, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. And also bearing in mind that there could potentially be coalition governance at the provincial level or potentially even at the national level. Those political parties, the smaller ones, and their voice becomes quite important because they can become, as some call them, kingmakers, or they could, if one or two of them decide to pull out of a coalition at a later stage, for example, those political parties, as in the example in other countries, could collapse those coalitions. So I think let's see what happens in the next couple of hours.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the key things, just from a democratic perspective, that people very often talk about within the political science circles is this notion that a country, for its democracy to be consolidated, it requires two turnovers of power, and that obviously was said by Harvard professor Samuel Huntington, who's quite controversial, but there are a few metrics that kind of stand up to that type of sort of about the coming out of power, but one, the ANC being below 50% on the one side, or on the other side, if they go below 45%, there's a possibility of a minority government forming with all the other political parties. Whether or not that is actually ideologically possible, I'm not too sure. But just in terms of the actual democratic process that we've engaged in, and the gains that we've made, what do you think this election will represent within that kind of trajectory? So this is necessarily outside of the results, but more looking at it, if we were to take a bird's eye view, look at our democracy, have we matured? Are we closer to that two turnovers of power? And is our democracy mature enough to be able to handle something of that sort?
So when the scenario plays out where there's no one clear winner, that is an indication that people, there's one of the authors on coalitions says that it's an indication that people have no clear trust in one political party to take them forward. And therefore they believe that the best form of government, or they put their trust in multiple players within the political system. And if that happens in this particular case, it's an indication of where people's trust lies with different political parties. But ultimately, an election is the will of the people, and political parties need to recognize that will in the way in which they form coalitions as well. Our appeal around coalition governance, we had a summit just a couple of weeks ago on the issue of coalition governance, is that coalition governance agreements need to be informed or be based upon the interests of the country. It needs to be based on, sound policies that potential coalition partners agree on. And it can't just be based around power sharing. So who gets which position in cabinet, or who gets which position at the particular provincial legislature. Because if it is based on that, and we have in that the example of Johannesburg municipality, for example, you can see the ultimate outcome for service delivery for people. Whether the country is mature or not enough for that, the test is really in the pudding, as they say. If the country is in that position in the next week or so, it will very quickly have to come to grips with the way in which coalition governance needs to be run. Political parties, from what we've been hearing, have learned lessons from the experiences in municipalities. there have been political parties that have been going to other countries to learn about their models. But from a citizen perspective, we have to ensure that those coalitions, if they are coalitions that are then formed, are held to account. We have to ensure that, for instance, the coalition agreements are made public and that we're able to hold them to account to that coalition agreement.
Mhm. Now, in terms of, I think, coalitions and the outcome of our elections, I think obviously one of the ways in which we measure whether or not, democracy is, taken embedded, and where when I say embedded, I'm talking here from, the people's perspective and not necessarily institutions perspective, because that's a different discussion. And that obviously speaks to political tolerance. And my question is obviously there are certain provinces that are highly contested. We know that KZN is one of them, especially with the entrance of MK, the demise in some way of the National Freedom Party. Obviously, the death of Mangosuthu Buthelezi obviously has an impact on the IFP. And so that particular province obviously becomes a space of great contestation. The question really is do you think that whatever government is formed there, that the results of that elections will be accepted, one, by the political parties on the one side, and on the other side by the people that actually cast their vote? Because obviously, we reference 2021, and I don't want to fearmonger, but we do obviously need to have some sort of mental and other sort of preparations in place for an eventuality that results don't necessarily go the way people anticipated it should or it would.
So there's a few important things. One is that political parties have accepted any political party or independent candidate standing for elections has to sign the Electoral Code of Conduct and be held to it, and have to conduct themselves in a way that then accepts the eventual outcome of a free and fair elections. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that when an election is free and fair, and if broader society accepts the outcome of that election, and let's say a particular party or a particular independent candidate refuses to do so, I think it becomes the responsibility then of broader society to then champion the cause for democracy, to ensure that all of the other players or those who may not be accepting it, there's some sort of reasoning with them, some sort of pressure that is, brought to them to ensure that they do accept the electoral results. So if you look at the example of the United States, for example, within this recent period where you had Biden winning the elections and Trump then being voted out of power. And Trump supporters were then gathered outside the U.S. Capitol and almost, in some ways, spurred on by Trump's own words, then stormed the U.S. Capitol. And many Americans believe that it was a very bleak moment in their political history. But it took broader American society to say that this sort of conduct is unacceptable. We're not going to allow people to storm the U.S. Capitol. We're not going to allow, almost the dismantling of democracy in some way or the other take place here. And similarly, in Brazil, we saw that took place with Lula da Silva and Bolsonaro in the previous election that took place, where Bolsonaro supporters wanted to attempt something very similar. And if this can happen in very well-established democracies like that of Brazil or the U.S., it's not something that is out of the sphere of what could take place in less developed countries. So, or less developed democracies or younger democracies like our own. So it's something that I think we need to look out for. But yesterday, I think the conduct of most political parties was quite encouraging, and we hope that that sort of thing persists.
That was from Defend Our Democracy, the campaign manager Zaakirah Vadi, who was helping us unpack just some of the early results that have come in. Obviously, it is way too early to make any real projections, and that is just because several key areas are outstanding. Most of the metros are outstanding. And so it's very difficult for us to make some. To our next segment. So, this hour of news and views obviously is sponsored by Africa Muslims Agency. Africa Muslims Agency is a beacon of hope to communities for over 35 years in Africa and beyond. So, in this next segment, we're going to have a clip played, which is our segment called Fired Up, with Hafiz Imran Chunada, who is a personal excellence mentor, and he's also the CEO of Africa Muslims Agency. And the topic of this particular clip, Fired Up clip, is today I will do what others won't, so tomorrow I can live like others cannot.